Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to today's knowledge sharing session, the RheinBrücke knowledge series on getting your ERP implemented right. My name is Kumar. I am the moderator for the session today, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Srikanth, who has immense experience in the topic of program and project management, having implemented projects across more than 25 countries across the world, large and small projects. I look forward to an extremely fruitful session. Couple of quick pointers to everybody. Firstly, we will be recording the session today. And secondly, if you have any questions at any point throughout the session, use the questions icon on the right side of your window to post your questions. Srikanth will be taking questions towards the end of the session. With this quick introduction, I hand over the session to Srikanth. Srikanth, over to you. Looking forward to listening to you today.
Thank you so much, Kumar, and very warm welcome to all of us, all of you with us today. And thank you for spending your time today, this afternoon, listening to us and giving us the opportunity to discuss and share our perspectives. And what, as a part of the knowledge sharing series that we've initiated today, whatever you will see hear from me today is a collective wisdom and knowledge and experience that we have gathered over several decades from several customers, several partners, several colleagues, and so on. A collective wealth of input is what we want to be able to bring to this session today. I mean, as setting that stage in terms of what we wanted to do in this session, of course, is as the theme goes, what is it that we must do to get our ERPs right? The starting point is what can actually go wrong or what actually goes wrong when you look at it historically. What is it that we must consider? Should we have a method and a process to be able to do it right? And fair, if you have a method and process, how do we actually do it right to maximize our success in doing so? So that is the theme and the topics that I would like to cover today. Let's look at what really happens when we have a negative experience in a project. Collectively, several of you, I'm sure, have been in this business either as a customer, have gone through implementations, or are an implementation professional, or a project manager, and so on. Top problems and experiences that you encounter if you do a lessons learned happen to come out here. There is a perception that starts off usually somewhere midway the project or towards the end that the execution is not delivering tangible results, that the project sponsor expected or the owners expected, and so on. That leads to a dwindling enthusiasm. So you would start to see behavior where project sponsors no longer attend steering committee meetings, or owners are no longer there who have spent the money in these projects. So there is a dwindling enthusiasm, and the main reason for that is that the perception starts to come in that the project is not delivering the results they're expecting it to. So there is dying enthusiasm. You need to control that. It also often happens that there is not enough visibility, causing confusion. People aren't clear what happens when, what happens next, what did we accomplish last, and so on. So to have the situation that you're unable to control the project when it comes to scope, establishing this transparency in terms of what actually is going to get implemented when you really hit the end goal. Also questions on project performance, how are we doing? An ability to quantifiably state that very clearly. How has been the project performance? How did it go previously? How is it expected to go? What is it that we must do, very objectively speaking, to resurrect it? Is another instance. And in the end, an ERP project is all about managing a transition. It's about managing the scope, managing the risk, managing transition, and transition actually means managing change. How are people ready at each stage in the project to be able to do so? These are all typical cases where you see negativity that is coming into your project that we need to control in order to be able to get it right. If you were to collectively look at all the lessons learned and throw in what are the main themes that come out of such a negative experience, is predominantly, you will see the words that are standing out here is what you would experience. It's probably scope, probably training, it's probably stakeholder engagement. Benefits, as I said earlier, it's probably around cost overruns, schedule overruns, not a clear understanding, and so on and so on. All of them, you'll see the big words that come out here are probably little to do with your software, little to do with the processes itself or the functionality. The common theme all turns out around project management and how you are implementing and conceptualizing the execution of this project. So what is it that you must consider in order to stem a negative experience and in order to maximize your chances of getting right? There are various factors that needs to get considered. Several of us in this particular webinar come from varying backgrounds, varying corporations that we're working for, and each project has a different influencing factor. There are compelling events that drive your implementation as to why you chose to use a system or implement a system. Each of them have specific time to deliver needs. There are compelling events, a VAT implementation or a business acquisition, and so on and so on. Depends on the size. You could be a large conglomerate across multiple cities, multiple countries, multiple continents. Geographical complexities must be factored in. Comes the nature of deployment. Are you trying to do it on cloud or on-prem? What is the kind of industry that you are in? Are there specific industry nuances that must be considered? And of course, last but not the least, is the size of the business itself. How big are you as a corporation, and how big is the scope or the quantum of scope or change that you're trying to bring into this particular project? These are influences that must get considered. While you do this, the key success factor in order to able to manage a project such as this is to have a robust implementation methodology. You having a clear method in to be able to deliver a project will dramatically increase the success outcomes of it. So you need to find the right fit of the methodology or the framework that you will need to apply. And there are essentially three pillars to it. The first one is the application of the principles in terms of how you will implement. How do you leverage technology and the right ideas, which is actually the use of the platforms that you will use? And how do you right size your implementation approach? These are the three fundamental elements that you must consider in your framework or your methodology in terms of how you go about implementing. The first is the application of the project management principles. So if you're either a vendor today in this particular webinar, if you're a customer contemplating an implementation, if you're halfway through it, or if you're project manager, sponsor, whatever the role that you are in the framework that you're trying to adopt or already implementing, you've got to ensure that it certainly uses the application of the project management principles. I mean, some of them are just the basics. All of them are just the basics. Have a clear objectives, ensure that your stakeholders understood well. You have a very clear, structured, methodical approach, as you see on the right. A clear listing of deliverables that you have. And the management of the transition itself from a project management perspective, the ones on the left, which goes all the way from how do you anticipate risks and how do you manage them? Is there a method that you're able to control your budget? How can you transition from, when you talk about budgets, from a burn rate, instead of showing how do you spend your money on the project, instead can you transition to how am I earning value on the project? What is the value that I'm getting for the money that I'm spending? That is project management too. How are you communicating it? How are you managing the change and managing issues extremely structurally? These are all key principles that your methodology must consider. So if you're already in a pursuit of it, look out for it, speak to your vendors, speak to your the partners in this, right? Ensure that these principles are included. The other element or the factor is to be able to leverage technology, leverage new ideas in terms of how to do your project more efficiently. How do you eliminate waste? 4 key pillars there. One is to induct the best practice models that your ERP system comes with. Application of it is number one. Second is collaboration between all members. You facilitate that using a professional services automation platform, commonly called as a PSA. A system is about change. The change can be managed through better training. So leverage a learning management system framework in your implementation. And finally, ensure that there is a proper structured customer support desk kind of a system available. So these are the four elements or the platforms that you must consider that your implementation framework actually has. The third one is the right sizing of your implementation. As I said earlier, you could be a huge conglomerate across multiple countries. Over the years, you have grown through your business, and there is something very unique about how you do it. So you're likely to have an appetite that you would need to customize a few things because there is something that's very unique to your business by the nature of your size. So in those cases, you must go in for a more standardized implementation method rather than rushing through that has a clear blend of waterfall and agile techniques. The other side of it is you could be a pre-configured industry template candidate. You're in a very specific industry, your ERP software comes with a ready template for the particular industry, but you're in that particular size that you probably need some change and anticipate some changes, so you have an ability to keep it minimal. Then you capitalize on an opportunity to fast track your implementation. A third set comes in where you have an ability to do things extremely rapidly because you're fairly confident that you can manage change really well. Typically, you have a well-structured pre-configured industry template, or you have a small business template that you can use. So you take this approach, you're not doing the unnecessary stuff that is typical of a large implementation, you're scaling it down to the right size. So the third factor that you got to consider in your framework is the right sizing of your methodology. So how do we get all this? How do you get this right from a methodology and a process perspective? So when you look at your project plans and your framework that you're trying to implement, you got to look for these milestones. Number one, application of best practices. Does your framework consider that? It must have an ability that it will help all the participants in your project to clearly visualize the to-be processes much early as part of the implementation cycle without ambiguity. You must have the driving platforms and tools. Then comes the transition side of it, the last three ones. You should have the method to control scope, a method to control or manage training, and finally the transition. These are your big milestones that your methodology and the framework should let you tick off. If you're able to do that, you probably have the right formula and the right recipe to do it. So how do you actually go about doing this? Let's come to the crux of it in terms of how do we get it right. The first is to have that framework. What we typically recommend is a 5-stage methodology in order to be able to do projects. You might be working with a different framework and a methodology that's slightly different, but more or less it must consider these principles. A typical framework is you start with the preparation side of it, where you are trying to prepare for the project. So you're actually setting up to succeed in the beginning. The crux of it is understanding the scope and understanding the to-be processes in terms of how do you intend to get your business structure. It's the design work. I mean, it's getting the concept right. It's the drawing work. Then you plan for it. Now that you know your drawing, you plan for it. That's your plan phase. Then you go about building it, which is the design phase or the construct phase. Once you do that, you get into the fourth one, which is validating it. You built it, you want the key business users to validate it and confirm that it meets their expectation or their visualization of how they had envisioned this. And finally, you transition. That is your deploy phase. That's the framework that we recommend, a 5-stage methodology framework that blends in a method that you can go fast, yet you're very controlled. Now let us look at how should you secure your project, which is the theme of this webinar today. Of course, the starting point is to get the foundation right. So we'll focus on the prepare phase. Essentially, the theme of this phase is to be able to scope for success. Main activities here is a change of mindset. If you're in this webinar coming from a customer's perspective, from the implementing company's perspective, the transition and the mindset that you need to manage is to shift away from a buyer's attitude into an implementer's attitude. You might have brought all the functionality and you might have purchased all of that, but it's all around scoping it to what you needed correctly to secure your project. If you're an implementer, a consultant, a project manager on this webinar, the transition that you need is a change of mindset from a sales attitude into an execution attitude. So the attitude is more around scoping it right, removing ambiguities, and managing that change. There are two key areas that happen in prepare. Number one is to inherit the best practice processes that come from your ERP into your business. Why this is so key to get this right, if you don't do that, the chances are that you will end up with your new ERP doing exactly what your old one did. So which means the net effect is zero. So you haven't really gained any business benefit at all, except for a change of system. So that's number one. Number two, to be able to, once you adapt to your best practices, to be able to scope in terms of how things are going, and to be able to remove all the ambiguities in doing this. You do that using a technique that we very strongly prescribe called as a CIPOC. And you take that and you identify your gaps, any needs for potential customizations, and you go forward if that aligns to your benefits. Now you see the word CIPOC that's highlighted in big and bold as the key to your scoping for success. So what is a CIPOC? A CIPOC is a Lean Six Sigma tool typically used in the definition phase, in the drawing phase. In every process, there are common elements, which is you have the process in the center. That is where, as you see in the picture, your process maps that come from your industry best practices get applied. But you need to adapt it to your business to remove the ambiguities around what's the input and output to every process. What is the preceding and the subsequent process? So this is the acronym of a CIPOC. So your best practice processes might come up with the roles and the inputs and the outputs for every process map, but it might not fit you. Because, for instance, maybe the size of your business cannot accommodate the segregation of duties that the best practice recommends. Or maybe your business is dictated by your customers or suppliers that you do things slightly differently because of the nature of the business. So while you inherit these best practices, you got to visualize and adapt to it. CIPOC as a technique allows you to do it. It allows all parties to come to the same common page understanding of what it to be processes. So in order to secure your project, the goal while you're starting off is to be able to convert these best practices into to-be processes. You do that using a four-stage approach. First, you take these process maps, you visualize them, look at if there are any process misalignments that you need to get over. Once you get over that, of course, the devil is in the detail. You need to get to those functional elements in terms of how some details are done. So you elaborate that using the CIPOC technique, where you get into the roles, understand who does what is the level of functionality that you need, is it complex, should you scale it down, is the complexity good enough, and so on and so on. You elaborate that. While you do that, you're certainly likely to end up with some gaps, either gaps of understanding or gaps of functionality, and so on and so on. So you do step number 3, which is a risk assessment, where any gaps that you see, you map them against 2 sections. Number 1, you map them against business benefits on one side, and the other, right, you plot them against the complexity it brings to the project. Based on that, you can come to a very objective assessment of what you must take forward as scope, what you must accept. Anything that is not necessary for the business adds complexity, you avoid it. Other side of it, you accept them. And what is in the center is what you model. So that way your energies are saved, you're conserving it in the right places, and you bring the right scope into the project. So that sets you to step 4, where you have a clear scope established. All stakeholders understand the scope. have a clear view of the scope that you're getting into, which means you can actually plan your project better for success. So you got your planning right. You got your scope right. Your next step is actually building up the system. So you got to design for success. That's the next theme that I want to get into. In design, there are two key elements that happen. One is your solution progresses, it evolves, and ambiguities keep reducing because you are beginning to touch and feel the systems. So you're halfway through the project. So it culminates with the design system being demonstrated to ensure that the to-be processes as conceptualized have actually crept into the system. Again, when you look at these callouts, the key signs or the words that you notice is the SIPOC. So the SIPOC controls the scope as you step into design. So you're allowing that the design work that you're doing in your ERP system is actually around the processes that you have visualized early and early. That way you control the scope. Several of us might have been in projects where you're trying to bring to proof of concept, and this joke starts to happen. While you're trying to demonstrate the system at the time, it actually turns out that you're actually collecting requirements now because the people either didn't understand before or now is the first time they're looking at the system. So that is what you already, although you're trying to control it in the prepare phase by using a SIPOC technique, you must bring in a few other techniques into your project at this time. Because your goal is to be able to finalize the design and get acceptance. So first thing is agree on the protocol when you're demonstrating the system. What environment will be used? What data are we using? Finally, document an acceptance criteria. What makes the proof of concept successful or otherwise? Then have an agenda, and here is the key. When you create the agenda for the proof of concept, it must be aligned to the SIPOC. It cannot be something else and shifting into something else. It must be aligned to the SIPOC. Then you must have an ability to score the outcome, not simply say, yes, this happened, it doesn't happen at a macro level. Then bring in that ability to control the scope and be present for acceptance. If you're able to do these simple 5 steps, you can do that by simplifying it and having a very objective method. You would have secured your design phase of the project, which means you have got it designed to how it is needed. So how do you do this acceptance? The recommendation is that you follow a simple, objective scoring and acceptance criteria when you get into this. As I said earlier, every process is to be, every area that you're doing during your proof of concept, you do it by the processes as you have articulated in your SIPOC. Everywhere an issue is noted, you rank or score those issues against 2 parameters. How incomplete was the solution? Extremely incomplete, couldn't go any further, or not at all, it was just a spelling mistake or something like this, right? The report didn't have a header or something. The other side of it, also score it by the impact of the non-completeness of it. Yeah, maybe something was incomplete, but it is actually a trivial process. It doesn't impact anything at all, right? So you rank, you matrix your non-completeness index with the impact of that particular issue. And the recommended directive is if you look at the screen as well, anything that is in red, a high or a medium from a non-completeness standpoint, the same extreme or a high from a impact standpoint, do not go forward into your acceptance test. Stop there. If you have an ambers predominantly, agree that you would wrap them up within the next phase of the project before you take it for acceptance tests. Greens, move forward into the project. Do not hold back your project because you also lose valuable time and interest while you do it. So having a very objective method to be able to score will take you through a phase where you're able to successfully wrap up design. If you have designed your system, you manage to get your acceptance, the next phase is obtaining validation and acceptance from business. 2 steps happen at this phase. First is you need to train your key users on the system that you have designed so that they are able to do the next important step, which is validating your design. In other words, that is called as the user acceptance test. Again, when you look at the callouts on the screen, the methodology or the framework dictates using the SIPOC yet again. So you'll already see we started from the SIPOCs in the preparation of it and identifying the scope, went through design of it. Now we're inheriting that into the validation of it as well. So that way the SIPOCs cascade themselves across the project, helping you control the scope. For you to get through an acceptance and securing this particular phase, it's all around training, validating, and getting acceptance. Must have a clear approach into it. Most projects, several projects you would have noticed as well that, yep, we got the design, let's rush and let's train and let's go forward. It can cause enormous amount of stress in the project if you do that. The recommendation is that before doing so, you must establish a clear training strategy. Preferably, use an LMS-based approach. Next important thing that you must consider in your framework is to be able to integrate your training content into your processes. Several times in projects we have seen the training content becomes extremely modular, extremely functionality driven, very product driven, whereas then we start off with the acceptance testing, which is very scenario driven. So there is a huge disconnect. Users cannot relate to what they have been trained to the processes we're asking them to validate. It will let your project start to slide off the track. So secure that by integrating the training content into the acceptance testing process. Third key one is you must include data migration into your training. There are two elements of it. Number one is when you include data migration is you must bring in data that users can relate to in their testing. So number one is just the inclusion of data. Second one is the inclusion of the users themselves into the data migration process. Because in the end, the data is owned by the business and they must be integrated into data migration. If you're not able to do that, you're likely to see extreme turbulence during your final phases of the project. So these are the first three elements that you must take care of. If you're able to do these three, you set yourself correctly to start your acceptance testing. However, the same rule applies. Before starting off, you must agree on the protocol. You must bring clarity to the protocol. What is the environment that we will use? What is the data that we will use to test? And finally, what makes an UAT successful or otherwise, which you do by scoring. So you score and assess the outcome, and then you make a recommendation to your steering group to go forward or otherwise. So if you have a very systematic small steps in between inserted into what you would simply do out of common sense, it will dramatically increase your success rates. So how do we secure it at this time and bring in objectivity into this? The process for doing your training and acceptance tests is a four-step process. Number one is you got to structure your content, training content. It must be structured on this cycle, which is the scenarios that you have built for designing the system. It must follow it. Next is content authoring. Several projects go through this mistake that you author the content, but it is not split by the roles that people are expected to do when you actually go live. So splitting and taking care that the content is actually split by the people or the roles that you're going to use the system when you actually go live is very key. If not, you end up with a massive disconnect because people are getting trained on things that they don't need to at all and causing confusion into the project. Third one is publishing it. Preferably you have an LMS approach where you have an online portal or a training portal and users come in and so on, as you see in a visual. And what this gives you is the output, where you have the flexibility now that you can do in-person classes, but extremely structured. Several processes, you could simply take it for self-paced. For instance, people are doing, let's say, timesheets, expense entries. Everybody in the company needs to do timesheets or expense entries or something else. So it could be a massive challenge if you're doing a multi-continent, multi-country implementation, or if you're in specific industries where everybody needs to do this. It could be a massive training job leading to a delay in the project. So what you do is you bring in an LMS because such content can become self-paced. Plus, it can also give you job training and tools where it can automatically give you job aids. People can just print it out, have it on their desktops when they're going live, when they're using an UAT as a ready reference. The biggest output that you could get when using an LMS approach is your training content also gives you the test sheets themselves. So you're not burdening your key business users to go and create new test scenarios. And why do that? By having a SIPOC approach, you have already envisioned those scenarios. If you've designed it like that, your training strategy could automatically generate your test sheet as well, because you have considered the data too. So this will bring you phenomenal efficiencies into your project. So if you're able to get there, you've managed to do your EAT. Now comes the task of bringing objectivity. What makes it successful? There are 4 key elements for you to declare UAT as successful, which means your validation phase is successful. Number 1 is key user training feedback. Do not ignore training feedback. It's a very important thing. In the end, if you have trained people and if they think they did not understand, you actually achieve nothing. So you might have the best design, but inadequate training will lead to the same result. Ensure all data templates are actually verified and you're super confident the data can be imported well. Ensure all scenarios in your SIPOC that you're using for your UATs have been gone through and you have scored all the UAT issues. Apply the same principle of risk management that we have done earlier. Every issue to be ranked on 2 matrices. Non-completion, how incomplete is the solution of the issue and what is the impact of the issue. Apply the same protocol. If you have reds, do not recommend a transition to a go live. If you have the ambers, agree on the protocol that you would have them addressed prior to go live. If you have a lot of greens, that you can decide. You have the flexibility to decide. So apply this protocol so that you do not put the project into a lot of turbulence. If you're able to get through, you're actually in your final step towards your project, which is trying to secure your go live, which in other words is called as the deploy phase. Here again, when you look at the callouts, you see the word SIPOCs coming through. It should probably give you an idea in terms of how the SIPOCs actually control you all the way from requirements to finally the end user training as well. Because I said earlier in the SIPOCs, I was referring to the inputs and the outputs and the input roles and output roles. What are these roles? They're actually nothing but the users who are going to use the system. So if you build your training strategy that way, without spending incremental effort, you can easily get your training curriculum by roles out of the same processes. That way your training, end user training can be smooth and you are able to achieve the transition. Now, of course, training is just one part. You have to have the right recommendation to give to your steering committee or to the owners or to the sponsors, right? That you're actually ready to transition. For which you must have around 6 steps ready. Number 1 is your ability to conduct end user training well. So we spoke about the method and the structure and how to extend your training strategy to end users. That's number 1. Number 2, you must have an objective method to assess that your business is indeed ready to go live. Have a risk-based approach to be able to see what is the business risk that you create if you go live. Plan your cutover, very important step in managing the transition. And once you cross that, you must have the hypercare processes ready. And then have some heat maps, diagnostics that will help you to see if you're heading in the right track or not, so that you can take corrective mechanism and eventually be focused on closing out the project as well. So this is the 6 steps that you must take care of in securing your go live, which is your last step. You get that through, you're kind of done with the project. So what is your go live decision checklist? The 6 factors that you must consider. So you must take a more pessimistic view. Hence, you see a lot of things are in red and cannot, not, and that I've tried to highlight that. First is potential risk is your business cannot get the balances right on time. If they cannot do it, don't declare a go live and backtrack and so on. Even if the business is able to prepare the data, ensure that the implementation teams or the data preparation teams are in a position to complete their uploads on time. 3, ensure your key users are well prepared to provide L1 support. They're actually active users, active people with enthusiasm and knowledge to be able to provide them. 4th, often underlooked as downplayed and causes the biggest noise and frustration, is ensure that the users understand their roles in the new system, what they're expected to do, and ensure that their access is reviewed properly. Several projects I've noticed that we do everything right, but we kind of overlook something so minor in terms of providing the proper access. On the day you transition, the majority of the users don't have the access, they have the wrong access, and so on and so on. So get this right early. Ensure that your issue resolution protocol is followed. All issues that you said will be closed or critical are actually closed. So we follow the same matrix of looking at the issue list, non-completion, what is the impact it creates, rank them. Any reds, do not make a recommendation to go live. And any reds on these 6 checklists as well, do not make a recommendation to go live. The 6th one, very important, often overlooked, is to have a look at performance of the system in your production environment. Is it likely to cause a business risk? If you have secured them into an amber or a green, you're well positioned for go live. So which means you must take the steps for the transition, which is establishing a clear cutover plan. Several projects suffer here because we do everything right, but there is a lot of ambiguity on what happens when we say cutover. In plain English, cutover means switching off the old system, switching on the new one. So you must manage the transition very quickly. In a sense, you follow a 4-step approach here. Number 1, you port your static data and configurations. Step number 1. And when you look at the screenshot there, you see the planning is by day. So you must have very precise planning. In several projects, it's by hours, right? You do that very precise planning. You start with step number 1, port your configurations and your master data. Step number 2, bring in your master data that's more fluctuates more often, like your suppliers and customers and so on, depending upon the nature of the business. Step number 3, freeze your legacy system. Prepare your data into the structures that we have agreed. Upload them. Step number 4, catch up with the data that got created outside of the systems because of the transition period. Catch up with them on the live system and you can declare them. So this is the 4-step process, and doing this with absolute clarity, having a clear cutover plan, listing it by each data element and the configuration element is very key. Providing visibility to users on the cutover plan is very key. If not, it can cause a lot of chaos and negativity. So this is what you must do to secure your project towards that. So once you have cutover, you actually into live. So the saying goes, going up a mountain is fine, but coming back down as well safely is equally important. It's almost the same analogy. The first thing is hypercare. So you must have a hypercare approach. So what is hypercare is like a baby that's born. Baby is still in the hospital. It needs to be in the intensive care unit for a few days to ensure it's out of danger. So you must establish those hypercare processes. There are a couple of steps you do to do this very objectively stress-free. Number 1, have a hypercare team ready. Number 2, ensure that you have a customer support desk system ready. In the earlier part of this meeting, I talked about having a customer desk that plays a key role here. Ensure your help desk system is ready and all tickets are routed through help desk. Because it's just not about going live now, it's about managing the transition mindset that people have to be systematic in order for you to control everything. So route everything through your help desk system and establish some KRAs for hypercare people. Their recommended goals are no business disruption, right? Successful month close on an ERP on the first month. That is your goal. Because you could end up with a lot of things that come up now from end users because they have not been a part of the decision-making cycle. So they want this and they want that and a few other things. So you must be able to prioritize at this time and do that. If not, you will end up with a long journey of hypercare. Third is you have to ensure that you have some diagnostics in place to see if your baby is healthy. Is it showing the right parameters? So you establish a heat map, as in the picture. A heat map is diagnostics across key transactions at periodic intervals. Sometimes you can do daily or weekly based on the size to see if the volumes that you see in the new system are in line with general business volumes. That way you pay all your attention to the places where it is most necessary. So establish heat maps, discuss only the top issues in stand-up calls, and then be very focused on closing out the project. Seen several instances where we do all this right, but we don't close out the project formally. So it drags itself into a very, very long hypercare. When that happens, the team loses focus. You lose focus on benefits realization. You also lose the focus to transition the project into a continuous improvement phase. The improvements start to stagnate. So it's very key to be able to focus. Close out of the project is fundamental as well to be able to secure. So if you do these steps, you have a very mighty chance using a framework. You are able to control the project. You're able to bring in a method and a process, and you have been able to implement it in order for you to get it right across the 5 phases: preparation, designing, validation, and eventually, as you go towards deploy, how do you manage this transit? That is how you're likely to get your ERP implemented correctly.
Thank you, Sri. That was a fantastic session, and I'm very sure the audience found it extremely useful. Everybody in the audience, this is the first of our knowledge series, and we will have several more sessions coming up in the near future. And many of the concepts that Srikanth has been talking about in the last 45 minutes or so are covered, and you can learn more about this in our scale methodology training, the foundation. Any queries, do reach out to education@rhinecs.com. Shri, we have a few audience questions, so I'd like to take the very first question now. I think we have heard this many, many times in the past. What happens when there are too many customization requests from business users? And it's a common pain point, right? How to handle this in an efficient way. So
good, excellent question there, Kumar. Thank you. Coincidentally, I have something as well that I can share to give some objectivity to that question. Is yes, customizations will become necessary in projects because that's the nature of your business. It could be because there is something that you're very proud of that keeps your business very distinct. So there is a chance that a standard out-of-the-box system might not meet it. So you would have to incorporate that. It gives you business advantage, of course. Now, when you do that, the answer is to be able to keep it very systematic. What the framework our recommended framework is that you have a 6-step approach towards customizations. While you're in the first step in these 5 stages that I spoke about today, while you're preparing, have your clear list of customizations, what we call as a customization register. That's your deliverable 1 as part of your scoping. As part of your design, in your early stages, while you evolve your SIPOCs, induct your functionality that you're bringing into the customizations into it, have your functional and test specifications also updated. That is your second milestone. Bring in your execution results towards a proof of concepts, third milestone. Next, the next 3 milestones are proper structured release management strategy. The framework should induct that you have a clear framework of how you release them into your test environment once everything is validated. Step number 1. Sub-step number 1. As you into your validate stage, you must have a release process around your UAT environment, where you have provided incremental bug fixes and so on, and a third release process towards your live environment. So the answer is to have a clear, systematic approach to be able to do so. A 6-step framework is recommended under scale methodology that we provide.
Perfect. Thank you, Shri. That was from Mohammed. I hope, Mohammed, you got your answer. The second question, this is from Deepika. I think you asked this question or mentioned something called SIPOC, Lean Six Sigma based methodology. Can you just explain how we can use SIPOC for scoping? Because I think that part, if you could make it a little clearer. Yeah, thank you.
Good point again. This is because getting an understanding of SIPOC is very key, right? It holds, as we saw today, it holds the entire project together throughout its life cycle. I know this is what I have a visual there. It's a little lighter and so on, but I'll just explain the concept. Is in the beginning you bring your process maps. It's a 6-step process within it. First is you convert your process maps, only tell you half of the story. It's just a process visualization to see the big gaps from a process perspective. What you do that you bring that in, you convert that into a row column format, and bring in the recommended inputs and outputs for every process and the roles that the ERP software recommends. So bring that into a spreadsheet structure. SIPOC is a very simplified lean approach. Once you do that, you allow your customer or your business team to elaborate that in terms of specific needs that they have for specific processes. You allow them to elaborate that, and then based on the nature of the size of your business, there could be multiple scenarios. You could be one entity in multiple kinds of businesses. Let's say you're into landscaping, to construction, to sales, to retail, and so on and so on. But some of these business processes are common, like processing a sales order, processing an invoice, and so on. Bring in the applicability of these multiple scenarios to it. Once you do that, you have your to-be processes defined. So this is how you can do that in an extremely simplified method of converting a Visio or a process map into a row column structure. Allow business to elaborate it, apply the scenarios to it. Once it is done, freeze it and take it through its life cycle in the project. So that's the very dumbs down approach of using a SIPOC. It just sounds complicated, but it's actually a very simple technique to be able to do so.
Perfect. Thank you, Sri. There's a question from Mujtaba. I think it's a clarification that he's asking, which is the testing phase? So probably, I think when you're breaking it down, if you could just explain what it is.
Sure, right? Now, there are, let's talk about testing as there are two perspectives, right? One is you have completed the design of your system. If there are some customizations and so on, that is a subset of testing, you might want to test that. That's number one. The second flavor of testing is process testing. Often it is called as a system integration test. You complete your design, you run it to the processes that you have envisioned, and that way you test your processes as well. That's the second flavor of testing. The third one is which you do it at the design phase, and that is what gets you to certify that your designing is correct. The third one is allow for the business to test it at an extreme nitty-gritty level with business data, which is called as a user acceptance test. So there are three flavors to testing in this in the framework. You apply the technical customization testing as well as the first run in what we call a system integration test in the design phase, and the user acceptance test in the validation section.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Sri. There are a couple of more questions. I think we have some more minutes, so I'll go ahead with them. One question is, this is from Ali, and I think, again, a very frequently asked question. I have also heard this question numerous times. Data migration is a huge risk, right? How do we manage it? I think how do we address the challenges of data migration, what to migrate, etc. I mean, I honestly feel, Sri, this is probably worth an independent session of its own, if you have the time. But yes, please go ahead.
I mean, true statement. I think not just an independent session. You could do data migration for days and still struggle to explain and go through it. Of course, because data is key. And of course, when you talk about a system, software is just one part, other part is data. So you got to get it right. At a high level, the key to data is also to getting it scoped right. and articulate the business risk of data migration pretty early. As part of the prepare phase, while you're trying to secure your project scope, I tried to create a visual. I had it ready. You can see that as well. Is number one, the framework recommends what we call as a configuration tracker for any ERP system. Doesn't matter. You have a listing of all your data templates. Establish against it, of course, the basics in terms of the owners and things like that, which is fine. Also, how will you port the data? You will migrate it from an Excel sheet, you will write some programming or just manually do it. Determine that too. And then comes three very important sections. Qualify each data element, whether that data exists in the legacy system, yes or no, number one. Number two, does the data require to be cleansed, yes or no? Three, is there a transformation required in the data? For example, you're moving from an earlier system to a new one. You want to change your chart of accounts, or the part numbers will be changed. Your supplier coding will be changed. Then you're talking transformation too. Based on this, you know the risk with respect to data migration. So do this upfront as part of the prepare phase while you're doing the scoping. That way, you're giving your project managers and the planning guys the right expectation and the right framework in order to be able to plan this project. You also set the expectation right. So do you get the scope right? Then you can follow through the other steps. And in fact, on scale methodology that we are advocating goes into a lot of depth around how data migration is to be managed throughout its life cycle. We have around 6 milestones for data migration that you would have to go through in a project. Of course, it sounds very big when you say it like that. It's again scaled to the right size, whether you're doing it for a small business or a medium business or a larger one. You'll have to scale it. And we do have a specific course that we have built that we can publish as well shortly to bring up on data migration, how it is handled in projects.
Perfect, sure. I would still hold on to your promise. Probably we'll catch you for another session on this topic. The next question is from Pranav Kumar. He says, hi Shri, thanks for a very insightful session. What do you suggest the role and importance of an executive sponsor and interdepartmental alignment in getting this whole process right? Executive sponsor and interdepartmental alignments.
Amazing question. Thanks, Pranav, for bringing this. It's a fantastic question. I mean, as I said earlier, my first statement when we started this was one of the things that you see commonly is halfway through the project, you start to see lesser participation with project sponsors and owners and so on, a lack of enthusiasm. That is because you're not tying the project to business benefits. So the first thing is the recommended approach from a framework perspective is do not overlook the necessity and the importance of the project charter. Number one, be articulate on the project charter of getting your business benefits that are expected written down. And as you go through the scoping section of it, while you're breaking it up by department and so on, look at the alignment of each of the to-be processes to the expected business benefits. Secondly, is especially when you run into gaps that are there that need to be scoped, again, use the same approach of aligning each of those gaps and the decision around those gaps to the business benefits that you are expecting out of the system. And you have now an objective method to score what is the to-be process likely to be and how it must be. And that gives you an objective method to get that participation of the business sponsors into the project. Also to be able to objectively measure your departmental benefits and trade-offs between departments and so on. So at all points of time, you bring in your business case and the problem statement in the charter, include that into your scoring mechanism that I was talking about at each stages of the project. And in these, while you transition from each phase, keep an eye on the measurement of the business benefits so that we're able to compare against the originally expected business benefits. That way you secure enthusiasm, you secure the right decisions, and the role of that particular group, to answer the first question, is to take decisions throughout the project lifecycle that are in support of the business benefits. That is the role as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Sri. I have a question from Hassan Asif. Your slide showed that we should train users before UAT, but if we are not sure that the users will accept this, can we really train them? So
Good, fantastic.
Yeah. Okay.
Fantastic question. Identifying the right participants in the proof of concept and having a training strategy and forming your change agents as part of change management is a big topic. It's key. So if you bring in the right change agents who manage that communication, awareness, and commitment, you can secure that. You will not have this problem. So you must have the right change agents and the right key business participants earlier on in your design phase secure. When you wrap up your design phase, those people become your change agents for your key user training, because they will in turn now validate the system based on that particular training. So to answer your question, Asif, is to manage that change, having the change network, and you will certainly run into your problem that you said if you do not have business participation in your project right from day one. So participation of the business on the project is key. And if you're able to manage through these phases that I was talking about, you will not have that particular situation where you don't have that participation and acceptance of the solution at that time.
Thanks, Sri. I think that was pretty clear. And again, I think this is also a fantastic topic for another session because this is a very complex topic. I know we are almost out of time, so I would not like to have a follow-up question, even though I have a couple. One very last question, and I think we are almost like down to the last minute, is, are these artifacts available for us after this session?
Yes. As I said earlier, all these artifacts are intended to be published as these training courses. They will be supported with detailed explanations around how each of these steps will be done and what are the templates that you can use, when, and so on. That is the intention, to make this out as part of the education service.
Thank you so much, Sri, and thanks, audience. You've been wonderful. Lots of very interesting questions, lots of interaction. We will continue these knowledge series. We already identified 2 topics on data migration and change management. I hope we can get Sri back on the panel very soon. Thanks for your participation and look forward to seeing you once again. Thank you very much, Sri, and thanks, everyone.
Thank you all once again. Wish you a fantastic day. Thank you.